David Welker is our speaker tonight, and I'm certainly glad he's here. He's a professional historian and a military analyst for the government, and he has written 3 books on the Civil War. One I know is on Chantilly, and the one that he's going to talk about tonight, the Cornfield at Antietam. I think it came out in February, am I right, David?
That's right.
February?
Yep.
Casemate Publications, and he has also written in numerous history journals, magazines, and there is an excerpt from his book in the Civil War Times for September.
That's
and
right.
He lives in Centerville, so he's not too far away, although you could be anywhere with this.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad you're here, and take it away. David.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. I'm a member of a roundtable myself up here at the Bull Run Civil War Roundtable, and you know, roundtables, as you know, are going through some difficult times as things change. But it's great to see such a healthy, successful, active roundtable as the Rappahannock Group. I mean, it's impressive the amount of things that you guys have going on. So I want to thank you for allowing me to share what I'm going to provide to you tonight. Let me pull up my presentation and see if this works. No, that's not it. Let's try this. There we go. Okay. All right. So what I want to do is give you a brief overview of the Cornfield action at Antietam. We all know a lot about Antietam. Most of us have been there. We've walked the ground. You know, we've seen the videos that the Park Service has. We've read books. You know, we know about this battle and how it's been presented to the world. But the Cornfield action is something that is a bit ironic. Everyone knows about the Cornfield. We hear about it, we see it, and yet of the parts of the Battle of Antietam that we know much about, it's the least understood. In fact, there are many books that will simply gloss over the action of the Cornfield. They'll say, oh, it traded hands several times. There was back and forth fighting. And that's unfortunate, because that complicated nature of the Cornfield, which is one of the things that drives that lack of focus on this portion of the battle, has meant that it's been underappreciated or a little understood in comparison with the Sunken Road, certainly, or the Burnside Bridge action, and other parts of the Battle of Antietam. And what's unfortunate about it is not just that we've lost many of the stories of the men who fought and died there, but the Cornfield action was critical to why this battle resulted in the stalemate, the marginal Union victory, or perhaps by some reckoning, no military victory for either side, that affected the outcome of the war. And I think it's important to understand this. I've tried in my book to unpack this a bit so that it makes it clearer for people to understand. And I hope that I'll be able to do that and give you a bit of an overview tonight. Well, why is this important? What matters at Antietam? We often spend a lot of time focusing on the battle itself and thinking about the back and forth of troops or the leadership or particular actions, and that's understandable. But too often we lose sight of the strategic reason why this battle was fought in the first place. And so keep in mind as I go through this presentation, and as you think about the actions of General Lee or General McClellan or some of the other generals we'll talk a bit about, what was it they were trying to achieve? Why were they willing to ask these men to die to achieve that goal? For the Confederacy, of course, the goal is independence. It was from the very beginning and remains until the very end, independence. The question is, how do they get to that point? up until the point of Antietam, the Confederacy is really hoping for the involvement of the British and the French, Europeans, to open up a second front and force the Lincoln administration to the peace table to negotiate an end. They're happy to win a battle, they're happy to win the war, defeat the Union Army, but they know that's not realistic. And the longer it drags on, the more likely it is that the South will suffer setbacks and fail. So they're hoping that the Europeans will intervene and turn the table on the North. To do that, though, the Europeans have said, yes, we support you. We'd love to see America fighting itself rather than competing with us around the globe. But we need something to prove that you are worth siding with. And so that's what President Davis and General Lee are hoping to do. They're hoping to go north into the enemy's territory, win a battle on ground that they are fighting for that doesn't include the motivation of protecting their homes. Because the Europeans have said, well, anybody can fight to the death to protect their homes. But the country we want to support is one that can take it on the offensive, that can bring this war to the North. And that's what Lee is hoping to do. There are other objectives: living off the land, taking food from northern farmers, freeing the Shenandoah Valley to harvest its crops, all those sorts of things. All goals, but none of them as important as winning a major battle to prove to the Europeans to get involved. The North's objective, of course, is exactly the opposite. It's to preserve the Union. It's to end the rebellion, to keep the South from being independent. And those diametrically opposed goals mean that this battle is going to be critical to advancing one or the other. They both can't win. And so at the end, one is going to come out the victor, regardless of what happens tactically. Strategically is what really matters. So this battle is important to both sides. And another thing that I want to bring up is the leadership, because the leadership involved on both sides at the very top of these armies is critical to how this action is going to be fought. Now, General Lee, we understand, I think, pretty well. We all know Marse Robert, and we've studied his actions, his campaigns. We know a bit about his character, even if it's being reassessed today. Nonetheless, Lee is a fairly well-known quantity, and certainly at Antietam, his approach is going to be somewhat different from what he's traditionally done, in that instead of going on the offensive and launching the attack is, in essence, being in Maryland in the first place. So Lee's approach to this battle is he's going to wait on the defense, he's going to let the Union attack his position, and then when they've beaten themselves down, when they're weak, then he'll turn on go on the offensive. So he's going to let McClellan's army wear itself out. An atypical tactical approach for General Lee, but it still fits with his thinking about how best to use this battle to achieve that strategic objective of winning to advance Southern independence. Now, General McClellan's objective is similar. They both want to win this battle, but McClellan knows that he's got to attack. He can't sit on the defense. He's come back to the army, replaced his enemy, John Pope, and this is his second and probably final chance to prove that he deserves to be the commanding general. So he's got to attack. He knows that's what Washington wants. And contrary to what many people think about George McClellan, he's actually going to be very aggressive in this campaign. And he's going to push forward in ways that we typically don't think of George McClellan doing. He gets the reputation as having the slows, to quote Lincoln, or being overly cautious, being being more afraid of losing than of winning, and always being cautious. But that kind of context, I think, is important because it's the leadership styles and the actions, the way these men approach battle, that is going to make the difference here at Antietam. Lee is an iterative thinker. That means that he is somebody who can assess a situation and see in it multiple ways to move forward. So if he's got to get his army from point A to point B, and there's an obstacle in the way, well, he might attack that obstacle in a given way. And if he runs into a new obstacle, or if that obstacle changes, he won't just keep going forward with his plan. He'll come up with something new. He'll find an opportunity in disaster. And that iterative approach to tactical actions is really what makes Lee such a great general. He thinks on his feet, in short, and he's brilliant about it. He can grab victory out of the jaws of defeat, and we know that he does it over and over again, and he'll continue to do it afterwards, after Antietam. But George McClellan is the one whose approach to managing battles is the one that really drives Antietam, because as the attacker, he is the one who's going to have to react to Lee's actions. He wants to win this battle, and so for that to happen, he has to take charge. His plan can't just be good, it's got to be implemented effectively. And that is where McClellan is going to find some real challenges, because George McClellan is many things. We all know he's kind of arrogant. We all know he's kind of a jerk. He looks good on a horse. You can see that he certainly looks a lot more dashing than the slightly rumpled Grandpa Lee there, sitting there. And he's brilliant. He's a man who can master languages, master mathematics, graduated second in his class at West Point. Simply a brilliant man. But he is a linear thinker. To get from point A to point B, he comes up with a good plan, and his approach to dealing with obstacles is to simply push forward with that plan and make it work through determination, through planning, through effective implementation. He's going to overcome obstacles through force of his will. And the problem with that is sometimes as a commander, you can't do that. No matter how hard you work, no matter how thoughtful you are, or how on top of the situation, there are things you cannot overcome as a commander. You've got to look for alternative ways to achieve the objective. So that means for General McClellan that the plan that he comes up with, he is going to stick with to virtually the bitter end. And let's take a look at that plan. So here's the ground of Antietam. Many of us, again, have been to this field. We're familiar with the ground. And I'll get my pointer going here. So this, of course, is Antietam Creek. It is a pretty formidable obstacle. If you've been to it, you look down into it, you know that it can be crossed wading at points, but for the most part, it's really deep. And it has to be crossed, in this case, only at 3 bridges. Of course, there's the Burnside Bridge down here, the middle bridge right here, which we drive over if we've come from Boonesboro today, and the upper bridge. So those 3 bridges are going to be important choke points for either side, no matter who attacks. If one side is, as the Federals are here, on the eastern bank and the Confederates are over here on the western bank, somebody's got to cross Antietam Creek. And that's what General McClellan is going to do. So for those who would argue that George McClellan is so cautious and careful, think about that careful general taking his army, the bulk of his army, across a creek that can only be crossed at 3 choke points, that can't be easily run back over, and risking that. So it's a daring move on McClellan's part, despite his reputation. So McClellan's plan is actually a pretty solid one. The opening, it's going to have 3 phases when it gets underway. So the first phase is he's going to attack the Confederate left up here across. He's going to send 2 of his corps, the 1st and the 12th, across the upper bridge, and they're going to launch that opening strike to threaten Lee's right, or to threaten Lee's left. The second phase is down here, and it's going to be an attack on across the Burnside Bridge, south of Sharpsburg. So the goal here is once Lee has moved his troops to those two flanks and he's weakened the center, then the main attack launched by the US regulars under McClellan's pal Fitzjohn Porter, going to come across the middle bridge, and they're going to break that line in the weakened center. Now, all the routes, Lee has three routes to escape. He can go north, he can go south, or he can go west. This battle actually will cut off potentially all three of Lee's escape routes. And so it's actually a very good plan. The challenge is, how will it be implemented? And because McClellan is a linear thinker, each of these phases has to unfold just as he intends. He will decide the timing, so he doesn't say, well, by 9 o'clock, Hooker must have broken Lee's left. He's going to be the decider, the man who will hold this plan together. He will launch each phase in turn when it suits him and when he believes the time is right. So McClellan is going to be the glue that holds this together. What he doesn't want is his generals thinking for themselves. And so when McClellan tells Joe Hooker, who he's going to give command of both his 1st and the 12th Corps up here, the opening attack, he's going to tell Joe Hooker alone what the plan is. Only Hooker knows about these three phases, and that once his part is successful, then McClellan will order Burnside down here to launch his portion of the attack. So Hooker's action is tremendously important. And that action is going to occur on this ground. Now this is a close-up look, just to orient us a bit. Here is the Dunker Church, and here is the Miller House. Now the terrain, if you've been here, you know that it's gently rolling terrain. It doesn't really look like much. There are some hills and some dips, but none of them are very major. So when Joe Hooker rides onto this ground late on September 16th, 1862, in the gathering darkness, he rides down here into Miller's fallow fields. And he's going to see a couple of facts. He's going to see that this is roughly where Lee's left is. Now, he does not know the actual left is up here on Nicodemus Heights or Nicodemus Hill. So Hooker knows there are Confederates in here, but he doesn't know exactly where the far left of Lee's line is. And it doesn't really matter because his goal is not to turn the end, it's to attack it and break it. Because remember, the goal of Hooker's attack is, yes, to get up on the ridge, to break Lee's left, but it's also to draw troops away from that center, to begin the weakening of the center, to ready the ground for the US regulars and Porter's 5th Corps to launch the main and final attack. So Hooker knows that he's got a tough job ahead of him, and that's why McClellan has given him 2 corps to command here, because he knows the casualties are going to be high. Lee will move all of his troops up here to the left, and he knows that it's going to be a tough slog for Hooker to succeed. But Hooker, as he rides this ground, does the best he can in the darkness and realizes that he's going to be fighting inside a box. Now, this is all David Miller's farm. David and Margaret Miller own this farm, and it's bounded on 3 sides. This is the East Woods. Up here is the North Woods, and this is the West Woods. And of course, there's the Dunker Church down here. And all of this ground is open. This is a grassy field. There's a fallow field here. There's a plowed field up here. And then the cornfield is roughly this area here. We'll see that in a little bit. But I want to talk a bit first about the Miller farm itself, because as that attack occurs, they're going to have to pass through or around the Miller farm. Now, today, if you go to the Miller farm, and I'll show you a wartime picture of the house, You can see the house, it still stands. It's been renovated a bit and updated, but it's still essentially the same house that was there in 1862, built originally in sometime before 1844. At the time of the battle, the Millers had not only their house and a spring house that's still there, they had a barn across the road and another shed, and those are still there as well. But what's missing today is this orchard. It's an orchard full of trees, and then Mrs. Miller, Margaret Miller's garden. All of these, as you can see, are fenced. So for troops having to move through them, they're going to find real challenges. And for the most part, they're going to move around the Miller farm, because those fences are so formidable that they decide not to try and attack through them. And in fact, the first regiments that do find it's impossible to tear those fences down. So this is a look at the Miller farm taken in late 1862. That is, we think, the Miller family on the porch, not David, but David might be the man in the hat. It's not clear, we don't know for sure. But it is certainly the Miller family in 1862. And you can see that their house is relatively unscathed. In particular, though, you can see the trees around the house. You can see that orchard to the right, and you can see that white picket fence. And that picket fence looks like you could easily tear it down, but in fact, it's pretty formidable. So this is the Miller farm we're going to talk a fair amount about. And this is the cornfield. Now, this picture was, again, taken in about the 1870s. It's looking southwest from the Miller's house. So if you walked out that front porch that you saw the family standing on, and you were to look southeast, this is the view you would have. Of course, there's the cornfield itself. You can see the fence line and a zigzag or worm fence or Virginia fence, whatever term you want to use. And there's the East Woods. So these woodlots were in fact there because the farmers kept their animals in these woodlots for much of the year. They acted sort of like barns. So unlike today, when you go into the East Woods or the West Woods and there's all this undergrowth, the time of the battle, and you can see it here because there's still farming, you can see how clear that is through those trees. That's how the woods would have been at the time of the battle. Relatively easy to move through. Thick trees, big trees, an obstacle, but something that they could move through, unlike the very dense, overgrown trees that today exist because we don't have animals living in them and eating all that undergrowth. So this is the cornfield, and it gives you a sense for the kind of terrain. This gradual slope rises up, and you can see some trees that kind of disappear over the horizon. So if you've ever walked the cornfield, you know that it rises to a ridge and then drops off fairly precipitously. And that's going to be one of the things that makes it such a challenge fighting. So Joe Hooker, on the night of September 1862, conceives his plan. And like McClellan's overall plan for the Battle of Antietam, it's a pretty good plan. He's going to throw the bulk of his 3 divisions into this fight. In fact, he's going to put 2 of his 3 divisions forward. It's a textbook West Point plan, 2 up, 1 back kind of attack. Meade's division will be in reserve up here in the North Woods, waiting to reinforce success or failure. Leading the attack will be these 3 brigades on the left under Ricketts' division, and then these 3 brigades under Abner Doubleday's division. Oops, back up. And they will advance in this column formation. So Gibbon's Iron Brigade will be leading the attack, and they'll be going more or less down the Hagerstown Pike, heading toward the Dunker Church. Meanwhile, Duryea's and Hartsett's brigades are going to march side by side, almost diagonally across the field, heading for the church. Originally, they were going to be supported by Colonel Christian's brigade, But Hooker at the last minute realizes there is an obstacle in front of them. There are Confederate troops down here, and we'll see that position in a minute. And instead of sending them in behind as reinforcements, he's going to send Christian around as a flanking force. So it's a good attack. And made even better, their objective is the small white Dunker Church. Now, if you've been there, you know that it's an easy spot to see. That little white church stands out on the grounds, and with the larger farm fields in 1862, it was even easier to see than it is today. So Hooker's picked an objective that no matter how complex the battle is, commanders will be able to look up and see where their objective is. They won't get turned around. Just look up, head toward the church if you get confused. So it's a good plan, but it falls apart almost at once. Now, as I go through the next few slides, I'm going to walk through the various attacks and counterattacks that occur in the Cornfield. This is the part that gets confusing because it does go back and forth. Control of the Cornfield changes frequently. Watch the white number in the center. That's going to be your count for times that the Cornfield changes hands. Okay, so it's going to begin being held essentially by nobody or by the Confederates, just by their presence from the fighting late on September 16th. So at dawn on September 17th, the men of Ricketts and Doubleday's divisions rise up, and they shake off whatever dust might be left from sleeping, if they could get any sleep, and they form and they begin to move forward. Now, Hooker has come up with a plan that depends on everybody moving together, and in fact, he's going to start this off essentially all at once. The attack will get underway. Those two divisions more or less begin moving at the same time, which is that the sun is up, Hooker gives the order to attack, those brigades form, and they begin moving. But as they step off, things fall apart almost at once. The first problem is that Gibbon's brigade, leading Doubleday's attack, barely gets beyond the East Woods, and they start taking fire from an unexpected place, from over here toward the East Woods. Gibbon had no idea where the enemy was. They knew the Confederates were out there in front of them and would be on their left, but suddenly they're taking fire earlier than expected. And Gibbon has no choice but to stop and deal with this fire because he's now run into the obstacle of the Miller farm. He didn't know that it would have been better to just go around the Miller farm. He's going to try and go through it. And his soldiers, Wisconsin soldiers, are going to try and tear down the Miller fence. They're going to find it impossible to do so. And as they stand there, they're taking casualties. And Gibbon knows he needs to get this attack moving forward, but he has no choice but to stop, return fire. So instantly, half of Hooker's 6th Brigade 2 Division attack stalls. Now, the other portion of his attack, Ricketts' division, similarly stalls. The first problem is that General Hartsuff, the most experienced man that General Hooker is counting on and General Ricketts is counting on to lead this attack, is wounded as he's reconnoitering the position, walking around out here in this field, in the fallow field south of the North Woods. He's hit by a stray round or sharpshooter, doesn't matter which, and he falls and is taken from the field. Unfortunately, Hartsuff had not told his second in command or his other officers what it was that Hooker wanted him to do. And so now the lead element of Ricketts' attack has stalled. Worse, Colonel Christian's brigade over here, which is supposed to be moving over here to attack these Confederates that we'll talk about in a minute, they go into some very bizarre situation that many of the men would never fully understand. Christian marches the men around. He has them stop. He has them change formation. He runs them through the manual of arms. Meanwhile, they're under fire from artillery the entire time. And finally, eventually, Colonel Christian will be called to the front. His regiment will be demanded at the front, and Christian will mutter something like, This is what I've always been afraid of. And he will simply turn and leave. He'll abandon his brigade in the moment that it's going into this opening critical attack. And so Christian's brigade, well, it awaits some answer, some explanation, some order for what to do. They, like Hart's brigade, will simply sit and wait for further instructions. Meanwhile, Durier's brigade, still under command of Brigadier General Abram Durier, will begin moving forward. Now Hooker's 6th Brigade attack has turned into a 1 brigade attack. And they're going to march right into this salient that Stonewall Jackson put out the night before. Now, this is the end of the main line. All of these troops are, for the most part, Jackson's. Some of Longstreet's troops will get mixed in, but this is the portion that Stonewall Jackson had. He's got the ground from essentially north of Sharpsburg, and then Longstreet has the portion from roughly the Sunken Road south to south of town. So all of these troops are under the command of Stonewall Jackson. Late the night before, Jackson realized that if the Federals are going to attack, the most likely place to attack is to take advantage of this open ground. And so he's going to create a salient. He's going to put troops here. And of course, we know that some of them are deployed forward here, and skirmishers are firing on Gibbon's troops. But he's also going to put Lawton's division and Hayes' troops here in that position. And that is what Durier is going to launch his attack at. As they move forward, Durier's brigade advances to the southern end of that field and just beyond the cornfield. They actually step into this fallow field just south. So Durier's position is right about here, and some of the men actually make it beyond that southern fence. Lawton's and Hayes' men and Trimble's men were pointing their muskets down a line of corn, told to pick out a man when he appeared and aim low, make every shot count, because Colonel Marcellus Douglas, commanding Lawton's brigade at this moment, knows how difficult this is going to be. When Durier emerges from the corn, they settle down into a slugfest, and Durier's men give a tremendous account of themselves here. Lieutenant Rush Cady of the 79th New York's Company K wrote of the combat at this moment. Stor Sherman was squatting down in the act of priming when hit by a solid shot, which nearly severed both legs at the knees and took off his right hand at the wrist, the same shot killing Dick Handley instantly, going completely through his body. Sherman's blood, flesh, and pieces of bone flew all over into the faces of the boys who were next to him. He asked for a drink of water and then begged Alex to cut his throat. He was in such agony. The 105th New York's Private John Whiteside, a little farther to the left of Durier's line, wrote to his father after the battle, "We were severely cut up, perfectly slaughtered, but our general was determined to hold that point at all hazards until reinforced." Durier would not find those reinforcements until he had begun falling back. And then General Hart's brigade, now with straightened out orders, begins moving forward into the fight. And they arrive just in time, because as Durier retreats back into the corn and back toward the North Woods, Lawton's and Hayes' brigades advance to take that ground. Hart's brigade is going to march right to the southern end of the cornfield, almost as far as Durier's brigade had, and they're going to halt Hayes' advance, and they're going to retake the cornfield. So in a matter of minutes, it's changed hands yet again, a second and now a third time as Hart's retakes that position. Now, the focus is going to turn over here to Gibbon, because Gibbon has gotten his troops through Margaret Miller's farmyard, and is beginning to deal with the threat across the road. Gibbon splits his brigade into individual components, his regiments, each acting sometimes in concert, sometimes alone. He knows that he's got to deal with two threats. He's got Confederates in here in the corn that he can't see. He's got Confederates out here in the woods. And so he divides his troops. Just as Lee has done on a strategic level, Gibbon is going to do it on a brigade level, and it's going to be brilliantly executed. John Gibbon controls these regiments as they go forward. His subordinate regimental commanders similarly act with skill and daring, and they push the Confederates back and begin advancing. They make it to the southern end of the cornfield, and Lawton's attack is driven back. They fall back and reach roughly this point here when General Gibbon launches his next attack into the corn and across the road and into the West Woods. The 6th Wisconsin's Major Rufus Dawes wrote of that moment, "Men, I cannot say fell. They were knocked out of the ranks by the dozens. But we jumped over the fence and pushed on, loading, firing, shouting as we advanced. Men and officers of New York and Wisconsin were fused together into a common mass in the frantic struggle to shoot fast. Everybody tears cartridges, loads, passes guns or shoots. Men are falling at their places or running back into the corn. The soldier who is shooting is furious with energy." As this attack pushes forward, Phelps' brigade comes in and reinforces Gibbon's advance. And so now 2 of those brigades are moving forward. But just at that moment, just as Gibbon's and Phelps' men are on the verge of crossing the road and breaking the Confederate line in the West Woods, out comes John Bell Hood's division. Dawes describes Hood's advance as he saw it. He wrote, "A long and steady line of rebel gray, unbroken by the fugitives who fly before us, comes sweeping down through the woods and around the church. They raise the yell and fire. It is like a scythe running through our line. Now it is a race, for each man runs for the cornfield." The appearance of Hood's division, Wolford's brigade, and Law's brigade sweeping around the Dunker Church, lining up along the Smoketown Road and then pushing almost straight north is too much. It turns the flank of Phelps and Gibbon and drives them back toward the North Woods. Yet again, for a 4th time, the cornfield has changed hands, and now it's the Confederates who've regained it. Now Hood's attack is going to push forward. Having gained this initial success, they're going to begin to drive. But Hood already has set the stage for disaster. The ground is a large portion of a large field, and Hood is going to split his force. The fire from troops over here under Gibbon and some of Gibbon's and other of Doubleday's division are going to return fire, and Wolford will be stalled here. Meanwhile, Law's brigade is going to push toward the East Woods to try and get around the 90th Pennsylvania from Christian's brigade. Called in to support Hartsuff's brigade, the 90th Pennsylvania moves alone under Colonel Peter Lyle, who takes the initiative to go forward to save the day for Hartsuff's brigade, to buy them time to get off the field. But now they're going to face Law's brigade's advance alone. But as that happens, as it pushes forward, Hood's attack begins to disintegrate. Law's brigade is tremendously successful, putting 2 regiments into the East Woods, which is going to play a critical role later on. Law reaches the northern end of the cornfield. But meanwhile, most of Wolford's brigade is still engaged in an east-west firefight across the Hagerstown Pike. Holding their right flank is supposed to be the 1st Texas, but it's confused. General Hood is acting like a brigade commander. This is, after all, his old Texas brigade, and he loves them dearly. And he's so familiar with them that he begins to take command in place of Colonel Wolford and neglects his duties as division commander. And that confusion causes the 1st Texas to move forward. And rather than securing this position on the flank to link Laws and Hood's, 1st Texas marches forward to the northern end of the cornfield. And there, they're going to find Meade's reserves. Hooker throws his last fresh division into the fight, and it's going to devastate the 1st Texas. They're going to take tremendous casualties. But they were never supposed to be there. And Hood would later say that they had slipped the bridle and that the men had taken command of the regiment from their officers and put them in a position which was impossible for them to defend. That's going to set the stage for Meade's advance. Now General Meade will take the cornfield, and he's going to push forward. But as Law and Wolford fall back and Hood begins to regroup, their place is taken by Roswell Ripley's brigade, which will march over the same ground that Law had deployed, now with their right flank in the southern end of the East Woods held by these 3 regiments, the 5th Texas, the 21st Georgia, and the 4th Alabama. Those 3 regiments, which were never supposed to be there, were simply there, with the exception of the 4th Alabama that Law posted to support the position, were there by accident. But they're going to hold the southern end of the East Woods and make the attack that Hooker launches, that Meade launches, in to retake the cornfield impossible to hold on. So as Meade's advance moves forward, it gets stuck. Its right or its left is held here in the center of cornfield. Meanwhile, its left makes it beyond the cornfield until driven back by Ripley. And again, the cornfield changes hands. It's at this point now, with all 3 of his divisions committed, that Hooker will bring the 12th Corps in. And initially, Hooker's approach to using the 12th Corps is to do exactly the same thing he's already done. He's going to send them over the same ground that all 3 of his divisions attacked through the cornfield, headed south toward the Dunkard Church, looking to see if, gee, maybe this time it will succeed. Well, we all know what they say about doing something over and over again and expecting success when you face nothing but failure. And that's Joe Hooker's initial approach. But then Joe Hooker realizes something's wrong. He's got to change his approach. And so instead of sending Mansfield down through the cornfield, as all of his divisions did, he's going to try and clear the East Woods, because he realizes that these 3 regiments mean that any Union troops that get into that cornfield are going to face fire, flanking fire from both sides. These troops have to go. And so instead of deploying Mansfield here as he begins to, he then orders Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps to begin moving through the East Woods to threaten these troops. And that's what they're going to do. Now, in doing that, Mansfield is mortally wounded. He'd been with his corps only about a week. He had no confidence in his men. They had no confidence in him. Mansfield traditionally gets a bad rap for his actions at Antietam. He paid for it with his life. But I would argue that despite this lack of confidence, Mansfield's personal engagement in moving troops into position was meant to ensure that it unfolded exactly the way it needed to. Unlike other commanders who will hide in the rear or direct from the back, Mansfield was right up amidst the fire, and he paid for that role with his life, that dedication that he devoted to his men. So, as that's happening, here are here's the 12th Corps. So Williams' division is going to begin deploying along the northern end of the cornfield. Gordon's brigade holding this ground. Meanwhile, Green's brigade, Green's division, Tyndale's brigade, and Steinrock's brigades are going to move into position across the East Woods. Once these troops are driven out of the way, then both of these brigades are going to swing forward, the entire division, heading for the Dunker Church, working together. It's going to move like a barn door. But first, they've got to get rid of these troops and troops that D.H. Hill is now sending into the cornfield. So when Ripley falls and is driven back, Colquitt's brigade comes forward and for the 7th time retakes the cornfield for the Confederacy. And they're going to reach almost to the northern end of the cornfield. And Colonel Colquitt, though, would record what happened next when he wrote, "We were exposed to a fire from all sides and nearly surrounded. The 66th Ohio's Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Powell recalled, we immediately opened fire on the enemy, and who soon broke. The enemy retired into a cornfield, followed by us. And while in the corn, our regiment engaged a Georgia regiment in hand-to-hand combat, using clubbed guns, a portion of the men having no bayonets. The enemy at this point was severely punished." So as they begin moving forward, these troops are going to drive the 3 regiments left holding the southern end of the Eastwoods out of that position. Meanwhile, in the main part of the cornfield, the 27th Indiana is holding this particular ground, and they're having to take tremendous fire because their only job at this point is to wait until Greene's division has cleared the East Woods, and then they can move forward. In the meantime, they are sitting ducks, waiting to move and sitting in the open. The 27th Indiana's Edmund Brown wrote, "The difficulty is to see the enemy. He's lying down among the corn. Another difficulty is that our own men have not entirely withdrawn from our front. But the men of the 27th coolly stand with their muskets at the ready, and when they clearly recognize a soldier in gray, they take deliberate aim and fire." Now at this moment, just as Hooker's plan is finally about to pay off and the stage is set for success, Joe Hooker is wounded. He probably was hit when he was talking to General Williams in an exposed position, and a round of gunfire fell around them. General Williams recorded the moment. Regardless, at some point, Joe Hooker began swooning. He fell from the saddle. His staff realized that his foot was bleeding, took his boot off, and literally poured his blood onto the ground. Joe Hooker's carried from the field, wounded, but it doesn't matter at this moment because Hooker's action is already in place. Tyndale's and Steinrock's brigades begin moving forward, that barn door swinging, hinged on Williams' division in the northern end of the cornfield. And there you see the 27th Indiana in front of Colquitt's brigade. Just at the moment that this happens, something fortuitous happens for the Union. In the East Woods, those 3 regiments have been taking a beating, holding on beyond all expectations once the South realized the role that they were playing there. And General D.H. Hill sent forward Garland's brigade to reinforce their position. But Garland's brigade was shaken. They had lost their commander at South Mountain a few days before. They had taken heavy casualties, and they were not anxious to move into another deadly fight. So when they moved into the thick confusion of the East Woods, literally strewn with bodies, the men are unsettled almost at once. And the men are pointing and saying, "They're the Yankees," and officers, they're saying, no, don't shoot. Those are our men. And the confusion reigns, and suddenly Garland's brigade breaks and runs. It's at that moment that Steinrock's and Tyndale's brigades sweep into the East Woods. And now all Confederate defenders in that critical position run for safety and the rear. As they advance forward, Tyndale and Steinrock, General George Greene's division, takes the cornfield and the East Woods, and now the cornfield has changed hands an 8th and a final time. And so this is going to end the fighting in the cornfield immediately. But there will be more fighting. General Hooker had been wounded, taken from the field. In his place rides Major General Edwin Vos Sumner with the three brigades of Sedgwick's division marching onto the field. And now he will take command and change the axis of the fighting and change the goal and move the fighting into the East Woods. A fight that could never have occurred without the action of the cornfield. Now, I would argue, had Sedgwick's men had to fight their way through the East Woods and through the cornfield, they would never have reached the West Woods and had the opportunity for success that, as we all know, would be squandered through the way in which the fighting occurred. So, in 2 hours of fighting in the cornfield, in the East Woods, in portions of the West Woods, the Union lost some 2,589 casualties, 417 were killed, 3,619 Confederate casualties, 717 killed. And I'll talk about those killed numbers in a minute because I have an update to that. The regimental cost paid by some of the units engaged in the fighting was tremendous. The 12th Massachusetts, part of Hart's Brigade, lost 49 killed, 165 wounded, 334, 64% casualties. But as bad as that is, nothing beats the 1st Texas, 82% casualties. That today would trigger a congressional investigation, might result in the removal of commanders, but in the Civil War, these things just happened and the war rolled on like a machine. So casualties in those 2 hours, the greatest casualties occurred at the Battle of Antietam. We're all familiar with this picture. We've seen it before. There, of course, is the Dunker Church, showing some of the damage from the fighting around the church. It's here. Those are men, probably Confederates, a caisson from Stephen D. Lee's battery that was fighting there on that ridge, where today there are still guns that you can go and see. And of course, we're all familiar with these images from the Hagerstown Pike. These are, again, Confederates that are fighting. That track, the road is on the other side, the right-hand side of the fence. That's actually a wagon road to the left. These men, of course, there were many, many more men. Many of them had been removed, and you can actually see some of their accoutrements of those who'd already been dragged back to be buried before Alexander Gardner took this photograph. So casualties were littering this field. And now we come to something I think is really interesting. This is the Elliott map that was discovered earlier this year in 2020. It was residing in the New York Public Library. It was hidden there. Elliott had drawn a similar map of graves at Gettysburg after the battle, well known and famous in the Library of Congress, used for years as an analytic data point, or as a data point for analysis of the Battle of Gettysburg. The appearance of one for the Battle of Antietam is a gold mine of data. And unfortunately, I didn't have the map when I wrote my book, because I certainly would have put this in there. I'm going to publish on Thursday, the 150th anniversary of Antietam. I'm going to publish a blog post on my Cornfield blog that discusses my data gathering and analysis of this map for the cornfield. What it shows, though, is that the Elliott map has 3,759 graves total, Union and Confederate, in the area that you see here north of the Dunker Church. You can see the very bottom, a little plus at the very bottom and slightly to the left. So 3,759 graves to the north, 2,219 Confederate graves, 1,540 Federal graves. And that gives us the first glimpse of the number of killed. So that number I have on the slide before is actually too low by a considerable margin. And what this map tells us is that all the killed figures that historians have been using for years are all far too low. In fact, many of the killed figures that are used in even in recent books, including my own, are barely higher than what this map shows for just the action around the Cornfield, the Westwoods, the Eastwoods, and the assault around the Dunker Church by Green's division. So on Thursday, I'm going to publish those findings, so you can check out my my blog to see a little more detail on that fascinating new bit of data. But as horrific as these casualties were, it was just the beginning. McClellan's first battle phase was not complete, and he, being a linear thinker, needed to have it done. He was waiting for word that Hooker, or then Sumner, had achieved the objective. And Jackson's line held, but barely. At several points, Jackson might well have been broken by better intelligence telling Hooker or Sumner where to attack, by a better bit of luck, by more skillful tactical maneuvering. Most importantly, there was a lot of fighting left to come. This is only 2 hours. This is mid to late morning by the time the West Woods fight ends. But even so, the Cornfield's impact resonates throughout this battle because of McClellan's linear approach. The struggle to achieve the objectives of that first phase, to simply appreciate that this cornfield, this ground that was supposed to be just nothing more than ground over which Federal troops would advance to engage Confederates on that ridge by the Dunker Church, that ground was itself important enough to hold, if not by presence, then by fields of fire controlling it. And the casualties that were generated because of this lack of understanding, or the inability to see that intermediate objective and to take and hold it, is remarkable and resonates throughout the day. Well, the fighting would go on, and I don't want to go into too much more detail. I want to leave some time for questions, but I want to leave you with a quote that I think sums up the moment of what happened in the cornfield. It was written by the 6th Wisconsin's Rufus Dawes in Gibbon's Iron Brigade. He said, "Whoever stood in front of the cornfield at Antietam needs no praise." And I think that sums it up rather well. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions.
Dave, this is Jeff. Ask you about that new map that was discovered. What was the name of that map?
It's the Elliott map.
Elliott map.
Mm-hmm.
How big is that? Is that map?
It covers the entire battlefield. It's go back because I think I only have. So that's the northern portion of it. It goes a little up, a little farther. It goes quite a bit west, covering all the West Woods. It goes east and south, all the way south of the Burnside Bridge.
So what are the physical dimensions of that map, though?
The map itself, I don't know because I've not seen it physically. But you can, if you go to the New York Public Library, you can download the map, and you can zoom in on it and in great detail. It's an amazing map. It lists the names of some of the men who were buried there. Elliott came east from California in '64, and so he was walking these battlefields, recording this data. And had he waited even a few months later, many of these graves wouldn't have been there anymore. So it's tremendous. It's a tremendous tool. And again, I encourage everybody to go to the New York Public Library or just Google Elliott Antietam map, and it will pull up these images and the links.
Thank you.
Sure.
Ready?
Yep, whenever.
Can we just, it's a question, not having been there for a few years. What's the acreage of the cornfield? How big is it? I
Yeah,
can't quite.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the cornfield is actually 24 acres. And if you go there today, it's still marked off in the way that David Miller had positioned it. It's the dimensions, it's 500 yards wide by 250 yards north-south. So 500 yards east-west, 250 yards north-south.
Thanks.
A quick question about the Texas, first Texas.
Yeah.
It's got to be the worst of the war. Am I right? Is that the
Yes.
worst?
Yes, absolutely. It's the, oops, sorry. Yeah, it is the greatest casualties of the war. The highest percentages of any regiment on either side in any battle for the entire war. 82.6%.
I don't hear anybody else, Jeff. What do you think?
We've got to have more questions here.
You know, I think folks are a little, they're not really sure how to do it. It's a lot easier in person.
Yeah.
But if you do have a question, just speak up. Now's the time.
This is Ben Keller. Can you hear me?
Yes, I sure can.
David, you started out with a very good discussion of McClellan and Lee's objectives and goals and what they were trying to do. What is your opinion of why McClellan didn't follow up after the battle?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there really is no, well, it's still being debated. There are those who would argue McClellan was, as he claimed, short of troops, that he was waiting for supplies, that he needed ammunition, he needed horses, he needed food, that his men were tired. All of that is certainly true. But I'm inclined to think that it goes back to McClellan's linear approach. He needed time to come up with a plan. When he had a plan, it was a good one. South Mountain was, by many accounts, the greatest victory the Union had to date. Certainly a more successful battle than many of the actions on the peninsula, more consequential than Rich Mountain in terms of what it might have meant. And yet, and South Mountain succeeded because I argue George McClellan had time to think it through, to consider all the options, to make decisions and plan, and then execute it. Same with Antietam. He's criticized for not pushing farther forward more rapidly against Lee as Lee retreated from South Mountain, and for squandering Special Orders 191. Well, Special Order 191 by that point was more or less irrelevant. It was out of date. Lee was moving, and he no longer had the objectives that he had at the time that action started. So he did move, but again, he moved deliberately. He didn't push quickly the way Grant would have, because McClellan wasn't that kind of a thinker. He needed intelligence, he needed data, and he needed time to come up with a plan. And I think the same is true after the battle. If Lee had stayed to fight, he might have waited a couple of days and then attacked again. But Lee retreated, and he did pursue him. Of course, the Battle of Shepherdstown Ford, or Shepherdstown, occurred. The 5th Corps under Fitzjohn Porter went deliberately, if maybe slowly, after him, and fought the retreating Confederates as they fell back into Virginia. But I think one of the reasons that that battle didn't turn into much more was, again, because George McClellan needed time to think through what to do. Lee was moving, and he didn't have time to come up with a plan. And so if Lee was determined to get away, he was going to get away. I don't think it was that he was cautious, because, again, you can look at a number of points in McClellan's career where he does very daring, bold things, but he can't react quickly. And that meant that gave Lee time to move away. And then he stayed there. You know, I think to answer a question you haven't asked, I think one reason that McClellan stayed at Antietam for so long, in part because he wanted to show that he had won this ground and he had conquered it, and he was going to stay there. And if the Confederates came back, boy, they were going to be dealing with George McClellan again. I think it was a desire to show that. It also was at that point a desire not to screw up, not to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory by overreaching. But that's a good question, and certainly it's what cost McClellan his job.
David?
Yes.
Did McClellan not have pontoons that he was relying on the fixed bridges across the creek?
He did not have them with him. He didn't think he would need them. You know, his goal really coming into Maryland was to find Lee and then fight him somewhere on ground of hopefully his own choosing. McClellan didn't really have a plan for what to do. When he found Special Order 191, he knew that was good intelligence. He knew it was verified. He began to act on it. Now, even by the time it was discovered, it was out of date. Lee had been moving and changing the plan almost from the time it was issued. But McClellan did take advantage of some portions of Special Order 191 that remained in place. And so I don't think he ever expected that he would have to cross a river, and he could have called for them, but he never needed them, really.
I bet Burnside would have liked to have had him then too.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, you know, Burnside's plan had some of the same problems. You know, he was attacking across a river, a wider river, certainly with pontoon bridges, but you know, he controlled that ground, and McClellan eventually controlled the ground too. When they first got to Antietam, the Confederates were on the other side of Antietam Creek, and they actually had to fight for that middle crossing. And the upper crossing was always in Union hands. It was the way the creek bends. It was always in Union hands. McClellan was very worried about the lower bridge in front of Burnside. He was afraid that Lee was going to cross it and try and turn his position. So he left Franklin's 6th Corps down there for an extended period until he realized that Lee was, for the most part, all in front of him. And there's an argument to say that McClellan's doing nothing on the 16th, and he's often criticized for taking a day and a half to size Lee up and figure out what Lee's doing. I actually think that there's an argument to be made that McClellan was hoping Lee would slip back into Virginia and give him a bloodless victory. Because at that point, they had invaded the North. It was something nobody had expected. And if McClellan could save the North by driving the Confederate Army out of Maryland, it didn't much matter how it happened. If he did it by maneuvering and forcing Lee to withdraw, that was as good as anything. So I think there is an argument to be made that he was giving Lee time, hoping that that's what he would do. But then when it was clear that artillery was beginning to mass on the ridge north and south of Sharpsburg, it was clearly wasn't going away, that he was going to have to fight. That's when McClellan came up with that three-pronged plan.
All right, Jeff, I think that'll be it.
Yeah. All right.
right.
Mr. Welker, thank you so much. That was a pretty comprehensive view of, what was it, 24 acres, did you say?
Yes.
Of
Yep.
A lot happened in those 2 hours. And
Yeah, sure. They sure did. A lot of men died. America's bloodiest single day, even worse than 9/11 to this very
really
day.
gives you pause just to think of that. But we certainly appreciate you visiting us tonight, and we wish you luck on your book. And are you working on anything now? New?
Yeah, so I just published, as you mentioned, the article in Civil War Times. Just came out today, or at least I just got my copy. I have an article on the Battle of Chantilly coming out in America's Civil War, I think October, November timeframe. I'm working now on a book on the Invalid Corps, the history of the Invalid Corps, both the Union and Confederate Invalid Corps. So, a little change of pace.
All right. Well, thank you once again, and good luck on this book and your
Thank
new
you.
endeavors there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And if anybody decides to buy a book and would like it signed, I'm more than happy. In fact, if you want to contact me, I can sign it, personalize it, and send it to you. Normally, of course, I'd have a table of my wares set up in the back of the room, but there are lots of books here virtually. I'll sign it. So anyway, I'd be happy to do that. Of course, if you want to buy it off Amazon or from Casemate Publications, I encourage you to do that as well. Be happy to sign it, send it to you, or send it back to you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you.
Thanks again.
Clap, 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 clap.
Yeah. Woohoo.
Thank you.
Thanks.